Ever feel like you're trying to fit, I don't know, an elephant into a shoebox?
Ah, yeah, that's not a bad analogy, actually.
It kind of feels like that's the challenge AI researchers face daily with these cutting-edge models. We're talking neural networks with billions, maybe trillions of parameters. These are like the internal dials the AI learns to tune, right?
Exactly. Those parameters define the model.
And trying to cram all of that onto a single machine, a single GPU or TPU, you just hit a limit. So the massive question becomes, how do you take these, well, colossal AI brains and actually make them work on the hardware we've got?
That really is the core problem driving so much innovation, especially in how we distribute the training workload. And it's precisely where we're going today in this deep dive. We're looking at some really interesting research. Came out of Google. It's a paper titled GPipe, Easy Scaling with Microbatch Pipeline Parallelism. The authors are Huang and several colleagues.
GPipe.
Yep, GPipe. It's a library, a new approach designed specifically to tackle this scaling challenge and in a pretty smart way, I think.
Okay, GPipe. Easy scaling with microbatch pipeline parallelism. Sounds technical, for sure, but the gist seems to be taking these monster networks, breaking them into smaller chunks, and then spreading the work across lots of processors, like GPUs and TPUs, the specialized AI chips.
That's the fundamental idea, yeah. Breaking down.
So our mission today, then, is to really get under the hood, understand how GPipe actually manages this division of labor and what kind of difference it makes when you're training these supersized models.
Right.
The paper apparently shows some pretty impressive results, too. Something about image recognition, AmoebaNet,
Yeah.
and also multilingual translation with a transformer model.
That's right. Two key applications they highlight. And the results are quite striking. It really shows what becomes possible.
I'm definitely keen to find out what makes GPipe special, what the secret sauce is, and what the broader implications are for AI development.
Absolutely. And, to really appreciate why GPipe is significant, it helps to first quickly touch on why we're even bothering to build such massive models.
Good point. Why
Yeah.
go so big?
Well, the paper itself points this out, referencing findings that show a pretty strong link between the size, the capacity of neural network, and its performance.
Bigger is better, basically.
Generally, yeah, especially for complex tasks. They show graphs, for instance, on ImageNet classification. That's a big image data set where accuracy climbs steadily as model size increases. Same thing for language tasks like machine translation. Bigger models tend to give much better results.
Right, I've seen those curves. Performance generally trends upwards with model complexity, at least, up to a point. But like we said at the start, actually training these behemoths runs into some very real practical roadblocks with today's hardware, doesn't it?
Precisely. It's not just a wish list item. There are hard constraints.
What are the main ones?
The paper highlights two key challenges. First, accelerator memory. Plain and simple. A single GPU or TPU might just not have enough RAM to hold all the parameters, those billions of dials and all the intermediate calculations, the activations needed during training.
Okay, memory capacity. Makes sense.
Second is communication bandwidth, the speed at which different accelerators can talk to each other, even if you can split the model. If the communication between the parts is slow, the whole training process can grind to a halt. It becomes super inefficient.
So it's tricky, designing ways to split the model efficiently, speed-wise, but also making it flexible enough to work for different kinds of AI models and tasks. That sounds like a tough nut to crack.
It really is. It's a significant engineering and research challenge.
So enter GPipe,
Mm.
promising flexibility and efficiency. How does it actually work? What's the magic? What are the core ideas that let it tackle these scaling problems?
Okay, so the fundamental idea in GPipe is partitioning. You take your neural network, which is essentially just a sequence of layers, right?
Yeah.
Processing steps.
Yeah.
And you divide that sequence across several accelerators. The paper calls these partition groups of layers cells. Each cell, which is just a bunch of consecutive layers, gets assigned to its own accelerator.
Which is like an assembly line. Different stages on different workstations. The paper has diagrams for this, I assume?
Exactly like an assembly line. And yes, figure 2 in the paper shows this quite clearly, the network sliced up across different accelerators.
All right, breaking it down, putting segments on different chips, that makes sense conceptually. But how do you feed the data through this distributed setup? That's where this batch splitting pipelining algorithm comes in.
Exactly. This is really the core innovation, the novel part of GPipe. Instead of feeding a whole chunk of data, a mini batch, into the first chip and waiting for it to finish before passing it on.
Which would leave other chips idle.
Right. GPipe divides that mini batch into even smaller pieces called micro batches.
Micro batches, okay.
And these tiny micro batches are then fed into the system one after another in a staggered fashion. They flow through the sequence of accelerators like items on a conveyor belt or, well, water through a pipe.
Ah, hence the name GPipe, like a pipeline.
Precisely. So while accelerator 1 is working on microbatch number 3, accelerator 2 might be working on number 2, and accelerator 3 on number 1. It keeps the hardware much busier.
I see. It's a continuous flow, keeping all the parts working more of the time. That sounds much more efficient. But what about the learning part, the gradient updates? How do you make sure the model learns correctly and consistently when the data is split up like this across different machines?
That's absolutely critical. And GPipe addresses this using what they call synchronous mini-batch gradient descent.
Synchronous, meaning happening at the same time.
Essentially, yes. Here's how it works. For each small microbatch, the gradients, the learning signals, are calculated locally on the accelerator, processing that microbatch for its part of the network.
Okay.
But the model's parameters, those knobs and dials, aren't updated immediately. Instead, these gradients are just accumulated, added up, across all the microbatches that made up the original larger mini-batch.
Ah, so you wait until the whole original batch is done.
Exactly. Only after all microbatches in a mini-batch have gone through the entire pipeline and all their corresponding gradients have been calculated and summed up, then the model parameters are updated. And crucially, this update happens simultaneously across all accelerators.
So everyone updates their part of the model at the same time based on the gradients from the entire mini batch.
Correct. This ensures the gradient updates are consistent, as if you'd process the whole mini-batch on one giant hypothetical machine. It preserves the original training dynamics, regardless of how many partitions you use.
That seems really important for reliable training.
It is. And they also mention you can combine GPipe, which is model parallelism, with data parallelism.
Right, where you split the data itself across replicas of the model.
Yeah, so you could have multiple GPipe pipelines running in parallel, each processing different parts of the data. That allows for even more massive scaling.
Wow, okay, so it's quite a sophisticated system. Now, the paper digs into some other key features and optimizations too, right? What else helps GPipe be so effective?
Well, one aspect they emphasize is the simplicity of its interface, how easy it is for a researcher to actually use it.
Oh, really? Despite the complexity underneath.
Apparently so.
Yeah.
They say you basically just need to tell it three things. How many partitions you want to split the model into, they call this K. How many micro batches to divide each mini batch into, that's M. And of course the sequence of layers that make up your model.
And GPipe handles the rest, the partitioning, the communication.
Yeah, the library takes care of the lower level details. And importantly, the partitioning itself isn't just random. The algorithm tries to balance the workload.
How does it do that?
It estimates the computational cost of each layer and tries to divide the layers into partitions such that the total estimated cost is roughly equal across all the accelerators. The goal is to minimize the variance in workload, to avoid having one accelerator become a bottleneck.
Makes sense. Keep everyone equally busy. What about memory? We talked about that being a major constraint. Does GPipe have tricks for that?
It does. A really important one called rematerialization. This is specifically designed to cut down the memory needed for storing those intermediate calculations, the activations.
Rematerialization sounds like rebuilding something.
Kind of. During the forward pass, when data flows through the network, each accelerator normally has to store lots of intermediate results within its partition to use later for the backward pass.
Right, for calculating the gradients.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But with rematerialization, during the forward pass, an accelerator only needs to store the final output of its partition, the activations at the boundary that get passed to the next chip.
Okay. So what happens to all the intermediate stuff inside its partition?
It gets discarded. Then, during the backward pass, when those intermediate values are needed to calculate the local gradients, the accelerator simply recalculates them on the fly by running the forward computation for its partition again.
Ah, so you trade computation for memory. You recompute things instead of storing them.
Precisely. It's like choosing to redo a quick calculation instead of writing down every single step on paper just to save paper.
And that makes a big difference to memory usage.
It's a huge difference, according to the paper. It dramatically reduces the peak memory required, allowing much larger models to fit. They give some comparisons showing the memory savings.
That's a clever trade-off, especially when memory is the main bottleneck.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned the pipeline earlier. The paper talks about bubble overhead. What's that? Is it a downside?
It's an inherent aspect of pipelining. Think about the
Yeah.
assembly line again. When the first item starts, the workers further down the line are idle, waiting for it to reach them.
Okay.
And similarly, when the last item leaves the first station, that worker becomes idle while the item finishes its journey down the line.
Right, there are startup and wind down periods where not everyone is busy.
Exactly. Those idle periods are the bubble overhead.
It represents time when some accelerators aren't doing useful work because the pipeline isn't completely full.
So does that hurt performance much? It can, but the paper explains that this overhead becomes pretty negligible if you use enough microbatches. Their rule of thumb is that the number of microbatches, M, should be significantly larger than the number of partitions, K. Specifically, they suggest M should be at least 4 times K.
M greater than or equal to 4K. Got it. So more microbatches keeps the pipeline fuller and minimizes that idle time?
Exactly. It amortizes the startup and wind down cost over more work.
What about communication? We said that can be a bottleneck. How does GPipe fare there?
That's actually one of its strengths, according to the authors. The communication overhead is relatively low.
Really? Why is that?
Because the main communication required is just transferring the activation tensors the outputs from the boundary of one partition to the input of the next partition in the sequence.
Yeah.
There aren't complex collective communication patterns like all reduce needed within the pipeline stages themselves.
Okay, so it's mostly point-to-point transfers between adjacent stages.
Right. And because of this, they found GPipe works quite well even if you don't have super high-speed interconnects between your accelerators, like NVLink for GPUs. They showed good speedups even on machines without those specialized links.
That's a big plus. Makes it more accessible. Now, there was one caveat mentioned, right? About layer size?
Yes. The current implementation, or at least the one described in the paper, assumes that any single layer in the network can fit within the memory of a single accelerator.
What if you have one truly enormous layer, like a giant embedding table or something?
That's a fair point they acknowledge. It could be a limitation. However, they do briefly suggest a potential workaround.
Oh.
You could potentially take that single massive layer and manually decompose its operations, like breaking down a huge matrix multiplication into smaller ones, and then treat those smaller operations as sequential sublayers within a single GPipe partition.
I see. So you'd have to restructure that specific layer a bit, but it might be doable.
It seems plausible, yeah. A bit more work for the user in that specific case, perhaps.
Okay. And one last technical detail, batch normalization. That's a common technique. How does GPipe handle that, given the microbatching?
Good question. Batch norm usually relies on statistics calculated over the entire batch.
Right, the mean and variance.
With GPipe, because you're processing microbatches, the normalization statistics needed during training are calculated per microbatch within each partition. However, for evaluation time when you're actually using the trained model, you need more stable statistics.
So what does it do?
GPipe keeps track of running averages of these statistics, mean and variance, computed across the entire original mini-batch. These moving averages are maintained consistently across all partitions and used during evaluation or inference.
Okay, so it manages to keep the batch norm behavior consistent with standard training, even with the microbatching. That seems well thought out.
Yeah, they seem to have covered the key aspects needed for practical deep learning.
All right, so GPipe sounds like it has a solid foundation, tackling memory, communication, and consistency. Let's get to the exciting part, the results. The paper showed off 2 main applications. Let's start with the image one, AmoebaNet. What did they achieve there?
Okay, so for image classification, they took on the ImageNet Challenge, the 2012 version. They trained a really big AmoebaNet model, specifically AmoebaNet B, with certain parameters, resulting in 557 million parameters total.
500 million parameters. That's substantial.
Definitely. And they trained it using GPipe with 4 partitions. The input images were also quite large, 480 by 480 pixels.
What accuracy.
They achieved a top 1 accuracy of 84.4% and a top 5 of 97.0%. These were state-of-the-art or very close to it at the time the paper was published.
Very impressive numbers. But the key thing GPipe enabled was the size, right? How much bigger could they go compared to a single accelerator?
That's where it gets really interesting. Table 1 in the paper summarizes this. On a single accelerator, GPU or TPU, the max trainable AmoebaNet size was limited by memory, but using GPipe on 8 accelerators, they could train a model with, get this, 1.8 billion parameters.
Oh, 1.8 billion. Compared to what on a single chip?
The table suggests something around 70 million was feasible on one chip, So using 8 accelerators with GPipe allowed roughly a 25-fold increase in trainable model size.
25 times bigger. That's a massive jump. Did they get 25x speed up too?
They note the scaling wasn't perfectly linear in terms of speed up for AmoebaNet. It was sublinear. They suggest this is likely because the AmoebaNet architecture itself isn't perfectly uniform. Different parts have different parameter counts and computational costs, making perfect load balancing harder.
Okay. So the partitioning wasn't perfectly even, maybe. Still, a 25x size increase is the headline here. What does that mean for image understanding? Does a model that big see things differently?
That's the implication, yes. A model with that much capacity can potentially learn much more complex and subtle patterns in the images, leading to better recognition, especially for fine-grained distinctions or challenging cases.
And it wasn't just about ImageNet performance, was it? They also tested how well these big models transferred to other tasks.
Yes, that's a crucial part. They took the massive ImageNet model pre-trained with GPipe and then fine-tuned it on a range of other smaller image datasets, things like CFAR 10, CFAR 100, datasets for cars, pets, food, aircraft, birds, a real variety.
And how did it do?
The results, shown in Table 4, were very strong. The large pre-trained AmoebaNet performed competitively, often outperforming models trained specifically from scratch on those smaller datasets.
So the knowledge learned on ImageNet transferred well.
Extremely well. It really backs up this idea that's become pretty standard now. Training a larger, more capable model on a broad dataset like ImageNet gives you a powerful foundation. The features it learns are general enough to be useful across many visual tasks. As they put it, their results support the hypothesis that better ImageNet models transfer better.
That's compelling evidence for the value of scale enabled by GPipe. Okay, let's switch gears to the second major application. Multilingual neural machine translation, using the transformer model. This sounds even more ambitious.
Oh, it absolutely was. Hugely ambitious. They aimed to train a single transformer model to handle translation between over 100 different languages.
One model for 100+ languages. Wow.
Yeah, and the training data was enormous, a corpus containing about 25 billion training examples, pairs of translated sentences across all these languages.
Just staggering numbers. And they experimented with the transformer architecture itself.
They did. They played with different configurations, mainly varying the depth, number of layers, and the width, the size of the hidden representations in each layer. The biggest one they successfully trained was a monster, 6 billion parameters spread across 128 layers.
6 billion parameters, 128 layers deep. That dwarfs the AmoebaNet model.
By a significant margin, yes.
What was the main takeaway from this multilingual experiment? Did the single giant model actually work well?
That was the most striking result.
Yeah.
Yes, it worked incredibly well. The paper reports that this single, massive, multilingual model actually outperformed individually trained bilingual models trained specifically for just one language pair, like English to German, on all the language pairs they tested.
Get out. One model beat hundreds of specialized models.
That's what they found. Think about the implications. One model somehow learned shared linguistic structures or translation patterns across over 100 languages, well enough to surpass dedicated training for each pair.
That's amazing. It really underscores how powerful model parallelism, enabled by tools like GPipe, can be for tackling these incredibly complex, data-rich problems. It feels like a step towards more general AI systems.
I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah.
It suggests these large models can discover and leverage commonalities across tasks or domains. In this case, languages in a way smaller, specialized models can't.
And how well did GPipe scale for this transformer model compared to AmoebaNet? You mentioned AmoebaNet was sublinear.
Right. For the transformer, the scaling was much better. Table 1 again shows this. The maximum trainable model size increased almost linearly with the number of accelerators. They projected being able to train up to an 83.9 billion parameter transformer using 128 partitions.
Wow, nearly 84 billion. Why was the scaling so much better here?
It's likely due to the transformer architecture's regularity. It's composed of repeating blocks of identical layers. This makes it much easier to partition the model evenly, ensuring good load balancing across all the accelerators. Unlike AmoebaNet, which has a more irregular structure.
Okay, that makes sense. Uniformity helps parallelism. Now, they also looked at that depth versus width trade-off for the transformer, right? Deep and narrow versus shallow and wide.
Yes, they did a specific comparison. They trained models with roughly the same total parameter count, but different shapes. For instance, a 24-layer deep model versus a 12-layer deep model that was twice as wide internally.
And what did they find? Does shape matter?
It seemed to, especially for languages with less training data, the so-called low-resource languages. They found that the deeper model, 24 layers, performed significantly better on these low-resource languages compared to the wider, shallower model, 12 layers.
Interesting. But maybe similar performance on high-resource languages.
Performance was more comparable on the high-resource languages, yeah.
Yeah.
The conclusion they drew is that increasing depth seems to be particularly beneficial for generalization and transfer learning.
So making the model deeper helps it learn more abstract, transferable knowledge that applies even when data is scarce.
That seems to be the implication. Depth might encourage the model to learn more hierarchical, reusable features, which is crucial for handling diversity and scarcity in data, like across many different languages.
That's a really fascinating insight into model architecture design at scale. Did they run into any specific problems training these incredibly deep 128-layer models? That sounds inherently difficult.
They did mention some training stability challenges. When you stack that many layers, you can run into issues like activations becoming extremely large or small, sharp activations, or gradients exploding or vanishing. Plus, dealing with inherent noise in a massive web scrape dataset of 25 billion examples adds complexity.
So how did they cope?
They employed a couple of specific mitigation techniques. One was carefully scaling down the initialization values for the weights in the feed-forward layers, adjusting it based on the model's depth. The other was applying clipping to the logic predictions, basically capping the output values before the final probability calculation to prevent extreme values from destabilizing the gradients.
Seems like careful engineering was needed to tame these beasts.
Definitely. Pushing the boundaries of scale requires tackling these sorts of practical training issues.
The paper also mentioned experimenting with really large batch sizes, right? Processing huge amounts of data at once.
Yes, they push that boundary too. They trained with batch sizes up to 4 million tokens, tokens being words or subword units. They believe this was the largest batch size reported for NMT training at that time.
4 million tokens per batch. What effect did that have?
The results, shown in Table 5, indicated positive effects. Increasing the batch size led to measurable improvements in translation quality, measured by BLEU score, and also lower training loss, particularly noted on the well-studied WMT German-English task.
So bigger batches helped performance, even at that scale.
It seems so. It suggests that maybe even larger batch sizes, if computationally feasible, could potentially yield further gains, perhaps by providing smoother, more stable gradient estimates.
It's just incredible the scale they operated at. Model size, data size, batch size, really pushing limits across the board. Okay, before we wrap up, the paper briefly compares GPipe to a couple of other model parallelism approaches. What were the key distinctions they highlighted?
They mentioned two main alternatives at the time: SPMD, which is often associated with mesh TensorFlow, and PipeDream.
Okay, GPipe versus SPMD.
The main point against SPMD was its potential for high communication overhead. SPMD often involves interlayer parallelism, splitting individual operations, which can require frequent synchronization using operations like all-reduce across many devices. This can be a bottleneck, especially without fast interconnects.
Whereas GPipe focuses on interlayer parallelism pipelining with less intense communication.
Exactly. GPipe's communication is primarily the activation transfer between pipeline stages, which is typically less demanding. They also noted SPMD might be less flexible for certain network architectures compared to GPipe's sequential layer partitioning.
Got it. And GPipe versus PipeDream. PipeDream is also a pipelining approach, isn't it?
It is, but it typically uses asynchronous updates. This means different parts of the model might be updated based on slightly older versions of the weights from other parts.
Ah, weight staleness.
Exactly. This staleness can affect convergence and final model quality. PipeDream often tries to mitigate this, sometimes by needing multiple versions of the model weights, which increases memory requirements and can limit scalability.
And GPipe avoids this how?
With its synchronous updates. Remember, all gradients are accumulated for the full mini-batch, and then all parameters are updated simultaneously. This avoids the staleness issue and ensures consistent training, more like standard single-device training.
So GPipe's synchronous nature is a key differentiator there.
Seems to be a major advantage they highlight for reliability and easier scaling dynamics.
Okay, so summing it all up, GPipe looks like a really compelling solution. It offers efficiency near linear speedup in training throughput, especially for regular architectures like transformers. It's flexible, supporting different network types by partitioning sequences of layers, and it's reliable, maintaining consistent training dynamics thanks to synchronous updates and careful handling of things like batch norm.
That captures the key advantages well, I think.
And the results speak for themselves, right? Enabling that 557 million parameter AmoebaNet, achieving state-of-the-art image results and showing great transfer learning, and then that absolutely massive 6 billion parameter, 128 layer multilingual transformer that outperformed specialized models.
Yeah, those demonstrations really showcase the power of the approach. GPipe was a significant step forward in making it practical to train these previously infeasible ultra-large models.
It definitely opened up new possibilities, pushing the frontiers of what AI could learn and achieve in really complex domains.
Absolutely. It paved the way for many of the large models we see today.
So thinking about this, what does it mean for you, our listener, and maybe the future trajectory of AI? Here's something to chew on. If we can keep finding ways like GPipe to scale AI models ever larger, to give them even more capacity, what totally new kinds of applications might suddenly become feasible, things we perhaps haven't even properly imagined yet?
That's a great question. Where could breakthroughs happen if model size limitations were significantly relaxed?
Exactly. What new research directions might this open up? Are there areas where you think massive model capacity could lead to fundamental shifts or solve problems that seem intractable right now? It's definitely something fascinating to consider as the scaling trend continues.